So welcome everybody to this talk on voting, the state of democracy, voter suppression in Israel, Palestine, and how that interplays with trends internationally. So we're going to start by asking some questions to our Israeli activists about what's happening in Israel. There's pretty historic momentum on the ground around the state of democracy right now. So I'd love to open with Kochav. Can you share with us a bit about what's happening with the protests, the atmosphere, and your personal involvement?
Yeah. So hello, everyone. Good evening for me and good afternoon for you guys. So I'll give you a little bit of background about what's going on in Israel with all the demonstrations that have been happening for the past half a year, a bit more than that. So it all started because of the corruption and because of Netanyahu with all of his cases and corruption situation. And in the beginning, there were like a few protests that were protesting in Petah Tikva. And it was 4 years ago, and over the years it grew up more and more until in June, it started to happen every Saturday next to Netanyahu residency. And then it was also mostly about corruption. And then on July, this demonstration got spread like really big among Israelis, and a lot of people came, and also the young generation joined this demonstration. What happened then that it got much larger, and it was still next to Netanyahu residence, but through the whole like roads next to it. So as I said, it was about the corruption and mostly against Netanyahu. But slowly, by slowly, you can see a bigger group of protesters that are more left-wing and also are against occupation, against police brutality, pro-human rights, and this kind of stuff. And then it's like a small block have started in this area of this kind of struggles. Like also about the corruption, but also about the people. So when I started to go there, obviously every time I went to the Balfour demonstrations, I went with my own sign and with my own voice. This is actually something that is very nice to see in Balfour demonstrations. It's very wide. I mean, each one brings his own sign from home, and each one raises his voice for what he believes. So you can see pro-gay rights, pro-Palestine, against police brutality, about the corruption, about the system, and so on and so on. Also, the Ethiopian struggle is getting there and have their own voice. So I came with my ideology, which is obviously against occupation and against the oppression that is happening here. And I always did that, but slowly, obviously, I joined this blog, and it was just people gathering around, screaming together what they believe in, and like people that I believe that they see like the bigger picture and say that it's not just corruption, it's not just Netanyahu, we have a bigger problem here. Like people are...
Sorry to interrupt. Could you give us a little bit just background information, like how big the protests are, how long they've been going, how often the protesters come together?
So like the big protests and demonstration have been happening for the past 6 months, and each Saturday it's around like 30 or 20,000 people. But obviously we are under the Corona situation, so it's not always like that. And then the demonstrations got banned, and we had the lockdown again, and then again. So it changes. And then we also had demonstrations in Tel Aviv and all over the country. And there was like a law that you're only in the lockdown. You were allowed to only stay in like 1 kilometer area. So you just had demonstration all through the country. It was amazing. So this about that. Do you have any more information you want me to give, Beth, about the background?
No, I think that's really helpful. Yeah, but if you could just, I mean, you talked about a little bit what's happening. I don't know if you have any pictures or videos to share, and also like some of the amazing actions you've been doing would be really helpful.
Sure. So as I said at the beginning, I came to this kind of demonstration with my own sign and my voice. And very soon I got my own megaphone and started to lead the staff. I'm also active when it comes to women's right here and women's homicide and all of that. Um, so what happened lately is that I just started a WhatsApp group with a friend of mine after a very deep conversation about the fact that the occupation is once again pushed away from the center of like the demonstrations, and our goal was to bring it back and to bring it to the center and to show people that it's that we have to talk about it, that there is a connection between corruption and occupation. So we started this WhatsApp group with a few young friends of mine, that they are all like very good activists and against occupation. And then we covered the Rabin Square, if you know it. It's like a big square in Tel Aviv, in the words democracy or occupation. Then it was like a big thing in the media and everybody talked about it. And our goal was and still is to show people why it's connected, and in hope that people, let me say it like that, I think this time here in Israel is very unique time, and because all of this demonstration, people are starting to open their mind a bit more and especially open their eyes. So when I'm coming to demonstrate in a demonstration against Netanyahu and against corruption, it's a strategic decision, because I want to bring my voice there and bring more people to my side. And actually this is happening, and this is why I'm very glad that it's happening. And also another reason with the anti-occupation bloc is to show the Palestinians that are citizens of Israel that they have a place to come, because until now many people ask, but why does the Arab community does not join these demonstrations? And I said, well, obviously they will not join because this is like a within Israeli struggle, and nobody speaks about occupation, just corruption. So how can they come? We have to speak for them as well. And actually, after this action, Palestinians also called us, and we saw it on the media, that they're saying that now they feel like they have a reason to come. And for me, it's very important that they will also feel comfortable to come and demonstrate in this kind of demonstration. Um, so that have been happening. And also, I think everybody now all over the world are talking about police brutality. And see, almost 6 months ago, the border police shot an autistic person, Iyad al-Halak. And just now, I mean, the officers that shot him will finally get their trial. But until then, they did not let the videos from the area out, and they hide it, and they did not talk about it. And I think this is another thing that united the young people in Balfour, because they united the struggle of the Ethiopians with Iyad al-Halak. But I have to say that personally, I don't think that his death is because of police brutality. It's because of the occupation and oppression policy. It's different, but it got together. And from Iyad, we had the way that we can show people that this is a part of occupation and oppression that the Palestinian people have been going through. I mean, for the Palestinian community, Iyad al-Halak is just another victim. For us, it's like very big and huge because of this tragic story. I don't know if you heard about him. If you didn't, I can give a short background. if you want that.
It'd be helpful to just give like 10 seconds of who he was and what happened.
Yeah, so just by shortly, sorry, I mean, yeah, sorry. Shortly, he was 32 years old. He's an autistic person, and he went to his school from his house. He lives in East Jerusalem, so it means he's like a citizen of Israel. And they suspect him to be a terrorist, which was not true, and he was with his metapelet Avner.
The woman that is taking care of him or accompanying him.
Yeah, she is accompanying him and helping him, and they started to run after him, and she asked them to stop, and she said that he's with me, and that he's an autistic person, but nothing happened. They did not stop, and he ran because he's an autistic person. I also talked with his father because I went to visit them after the murder, and he said that he was he was always very terrified from noise and from screamings, and he ran to a trash room and lay down, and they shot him in the back 7 times, and obviously he had no weapon on him, and then they went to his house and searched for a weapon, and there wasn't any. So it's like he's like a completely innocent victim as a result of the racist system here against the Palestinian community. So this about him. So I have to say that everybody also saw it in the Balfour demonstrations, that people are asking for justice for him. And over the time you had George Floyd and all of the protests, it was the same here with Iyad. So people also made the contact between George Floyd and Iyad al-Halak, and now here finally we see stuff that are a bit moving forward with the police, but yeah, let's stay hopeful that justice will happen here.
Thanks, Kochav. Avner, could you talk a little bit about the way this wave of protests is different, if it's different, from what you've seen in your activism in the last 20 years?
Yes, sure. So again, thank you all for joining us. So I've been active in the West Bank for nearly 20 years now, since 2001, with Tayush, and later with Courage to Refuse, and then with Combatants for Peace for the last 16 years or even more. And it's been a long journey, and a very interesting one, but a very depressing one as well, because the feeling is, it still is the feeling that we are fighting downhill, and we are unable, never mind stopping the occupation, the confiscation of land, the arrests and the killing. We are increasingly facing the need to defend our very right to fight for these things. And this is directly related to the state of democracy in Israel, which has been deteriorating rapidly for the last 10 years at least, and especially in the last 5 years. So we've been we had to spend huge amounts of energy just to stand and speak out. We've had, for example, our Memorial Day, we had to go to the Supreme Court twice in order just to get the Palestinians who are with us in this memorial service. I should mention this memorial service is huge by now. We had 200,000 people worldwide joining us last year, just 6 months ago. And the government is pressuring us, and they use all kinds of administrative means to just harass us. And of course, the atmosphere on the street, which is very, very hostile. So it's very hard to continue with this struggle when all we can see are very little victories. But we are committed to keeping this option alive, keeping this vision alive, because we are convinced that that we are holding something for people who for many years have either given up hope or shelved it somewhere, because the mainstream in Israel since 2001 is basically surrendered to this idea of there is no partner, and this discourse is just so powerful still today, and especially under Netanyahu. I think this is his most tremendous achievement. It's the killing of hope. Anything that is hopeful is rendered delusionary, naive, childish. This is the way they speak about it. And we are scarred from our previous military involvement and from this very long time of civilian struggle. And we're the last ones to be called naive. But we don't have nearly enough power to fight the official, hegemonic discourse. We do what we can, but it's very hard to even, scratch the surface of, or the it's like cemented. So people just got used to it. And we ourselves as activists got used to demonstrations with 30 people in some on some hill or some junction in the West Bank, or maybe 100 people, sometimes 200 people. If it's 500 people, it's huge. And very often it ends with tear gas and some rubber bullets, and sometimes a few arrests. And that's it, nobody hears about it, because mainstream media is giving up on the thing totally. So the Palestinian issue is no longer, it does no longer exist in the Israeli mainstream discourse. And this is the achievement of Netanyahu. Just keeping it alive is very difficult. So you ask me what is different. This is still the case. But what I was amazed to see, and I was there seeing these demonstrations against Netanyahu growing. And I remember the first time it was in front of the Knesset, the parliament. Just another protest against Netanyahu. And as Kochav said, the very beginning of these protests was, 4 years ago, with a few dozens of very, very persistent people that kept this thing going. And then suddenly, around June, it flared up. And I was there in the Knesset. I remember calling my partner saying, you're not going to believe it. There are a few thousand people here. Now, in Israel, you realize these numbers are big. And Kochav, actually, I just wanted to add to what you said. We have dozens of thousands of people in Balfour every single Saturday for the last 4 months. We have demonstrations on Tuesday and Thursdays, and very often spontaneous demonstrations in just junctions and, bridges all around the country. So every Saturday you would have dozens of thousands of people on bridges and junctions and along highways in Israel, all around Israel, and then a few others, dozens of thousands in Balfour. This is unprecedented in Israeli history. Such big demonstrations going on for such a long period of time. And for me, what is really hopeful is the fact that for the first time in 15 years, I see people in their 20s. I was in my 20s when I became active, but we've not had many young people join Combatants for Peace or any of the other anti-occupation peace movements in the last 10 years. And I think it's directly related to this atmosphere, to the way the education system has been reconfigured to raise a generation that is very, very narrow-minded and completely unaware of what happens literally on the other side of the wall. And people like Kochav, and I think Kochav, you didn't tell your own story, which is a bit of a shame. Kochav literally went to the other side of the wall for the first time in her life, right? I'm not mistaken. When you were like 6 months ago, 8 months ago, when you went to Ramallah, I think it was.
I mean, actually, as a child, I used to hang out in settlements a lot. But in my grown-up life, the first time I went to the West Bank, like in the Palestinian side, was to Bethlehem and Ramallah. And then I met Suli. It was 1.5 years ago.
Yeah. So for most Israelis, certainly in Kochav's age, no interaction with Palestinian whatsoever. What they get is from the education system and the media. And I see we have to wrap up in about in 3 minutes, right? Okay. And then seeing suddenly thousands of people out on the street, and Kochav is of course completely right. Most of them, the vast majority, are not about, they don't care about the Palestinians. It has to be clear. But, as Kochav said, once they face policemen and they face police brutality and they see the government lying straight-faced about so many things, then they begin to be suspicious. And we hear such statements all the time, and we see them on the boards they're making for the demonstrations. We were naive. I remember one. I realize now, one of the boards read, I realize now that everything we've been taught has been a lie. Things like that. Now, again, this is not the majority. This is the minority of the protesters. But with this atmosphere that is no longer willing to bury the hope and shelve it and wait and just live without it, I think there is a chance of first mobilizing more people, and we desperately need younger people, and then maybe move into a next phase, which is to convince all these people that are out in the street that Netanyahu is merely the symptom. We, inshallah, will get rid of him. I think it's necessary. It's necessary, but it's not enough. But at least I think that the challenge, the way we challenge power right now, is promising, and it gives people a feeling of that they can change, which is something that we've lost 20 years ago. The feeling that we can actually make a change. So this is why I'm out there every week with our own Combatants for Peace t-shirts and signs, and adding our voice to this polyphonic protest. Beth, I'm done. You are muted.
If I can add something, a small thing. So I just wanted to make another point. I want to initiate something new. And as Avner said, the Israeli street and in the Israeli society, there is a lack of information about the reality in the West Bank, like a huge lack of information. People my age, most of my non-activist friends, they are not aware of the situation. And And I think this is my goal as an activist, to raise the awareness. Like, this is the least I can do. And maybe through uniting the struggles, we can bring it more to the Israeli street. Because, and I have to say that the fact that people have no idea about the reality over there is first because the government is doing such a great work in like segregation and separating us. And like, for me, it was like, I took a decision that I want to know what's going on in West Bank. I mean, if not, this information is not so, I mean, you have to look for it. It's hard to find it. It's not that easy. And I can also say something about the fact that I don't believe we can build, I mean, we cannot fight for democracy here now in the Balfour demonstrations, but only for Jewish people. We cannot fight for democracy only for one side, because democracy and occupation do not work together. Democracy and oppression do not work together. Democracy with military government do not work together. And you cannot build democracy on administration detention. And I want to raise the awareness about a guy. His name is Maher Aziz. He's from Jenin originally, and he's a political prisoner, and he has been on a hunger strike for 90, I think today, 91 days, which is crazy. 91 days. And he just want to know what he did that brought him to this situation. But he did not have this kind of right. He just don't. So what he does is like hunger strike, and his situation is very, very bad. I personally also visited him, and I was today in a demonstration in the hospital that he's staying at. And I met him and I met his wife, and they both were so kind and gentle. And it's a really, really big shame. And it's very sad for me that most of the people have no idea who he is. And my next goal, and the next goal of the block, of the anti-occupation block, this Saturday in the Balfour demonstration, is to come with signs about Maher and with picture of him, and to raise the awareness. We also made like a small, like a very, very small notebook that gives some information about him, about what's administration detention, and about the 101 order, which means that in the West Bank, you're basically not allowed to even demonstrate. I mean, it's not allowed to be more than 10 people if it's like about politics. It's just crazy. And I think that now what is happening to the white Israeli society is like what's happening with the occupation policy is coming in. Because we also saw now the rules against the demonstrations and all, and now we can maybe a little bit start to understand what's the reality is like for Palestinians. And also when we talk about police brutality, which for us, of course it's bad, and of course it's very bad, but over there it's way worse, and it can end in death and shooting, and here it's not like that for now. No, but yeah, I just wanted to say another point.
Thank you. Thank you guys both so much for sharing the situation that's going on in Israel. It really does seem to be historic. So we're going to switch over, give me 1 second, to Aziz. Thank you, Aziz, for joining us. So we are going to switch gears now and talk about the Palestinian side of things, which is very, very different, the situation, as I'm sure you all know. So doing a 180. So Aziz, the first question for you is, can you just explain the basics of Palestinian voting rights and the different statuses for the different groups?
All right, thank you, Beth, and hello, marhaba, everyone. It's a complicated question and it's a complicated answer because there isn't one Palestinian group. I think Israel kind of succeeded in making this so complicated that whenever we talk about it, they will use one of the groups to explain why, oh, there is some rights and everything is fine. Not realizing we are split into 4 different groups legally between the river and the sea, Israel, Palestine. 4 different groups, different legal settings, different freedom of movement settings, and so we cannot really, even people from the same family. My aunt has a total different legal classification than me, and it creates problems even within the Palestinian communities, because some of us have more access and movement and abilities to work and make more living. Others have much less, and creates jealousy and envy within our own community. And that's, I think, where that setting, what Israel did in creating these divisions among us, has been, unfortunately, extremely successful. So let me go through them quickly. The first one I would start with is the Palestinians who are citizens of Israel. Often you are told that these became citizens of Israel after the war in 1948. They are the Palestinians who ended up staying, were not displaced, did not escape. That's not exactly true. For the first 18, 19 years, they actually did not have citizenship. They lived under martial law. They had to register police stations. If they moved from one city to another, they had to notify. It was quite an oppressive regime they lived under. But in 1966, the Israeli government decided to give them actual citizenship. They have Israeli passports. They can run for the Knesset. They are one of the largest opposition parties in the Knesset today. They never really been as influential in the Knesset. Briefly during the Rabin peace administration, I guess the administration that negotiated the Oslo Agreement, if you want to call it peace administration or so, that was the only time they had some kind of real influence on governance. Otherwise, Netanyahu could have actually lost his last election if Gantz would have made a deal with them. But most Israeli, even on the left or center left or so on, refused to do a coalition with the Palestinian citizens of Israel. They often described as the 5th column. They seen as not really legitimate in some ways, and that makes their work representing the Palestinians, citizens of Israel, harder. I would also add, even though they have equal citizenship, the idea that they are fully equal before the law is not really true. There are a number of laws that limit their rights, now not as much as others in other Palestinians within the river to the sea, but there are quite a few laws. The nation law is one of those that talks about how the state of Israel self-determination is only for Jewish people and so on. So that's one group. The second group I'll go to is the Palestinians in East Jerusalem. After Israel occupied East Jerusalem in 1967, they decided to give not citizenship, but residency to people in East Jerusalem. Well, that's pretty much the same as holding a green card in the United States. You are a resident, you're kind of a guest, you could become a citizen, but there's a whole process, which when it comes to Palestinians in East Jerusalem, that process is extremely hard to go through. I know that because 2016 Times of Israel published an article that said out of, at that time was about 1,100, I think, application, only 11 or 12 people got it in that year. So it tells you how many people able to get it. And often it's an argument, well, they can apply for citizenship. Yeah, they can definitely apply. Good luck getting it. And then you have, even if you apply, you have all kind of requirements. The worst among them is you have to go through an Israeli security check that takes years, and you just wait. I know somebody who applied and was given the first meeting just to talk about it, to start the process 3 years from now. So
just to clarify, these are people who were born and raised in Jerusalem and whose parents were born and raised in Jerusalem and whose grandparents were born and raised, like Jerusalem residents.
To even understand how ridiculous this law is, if you are a resident of Jerusalem and go to live in Ramallah, you lose most of your rights as a Jerusalem resident, because they say you right in Jerusalem based on your residency in Jerusalem. The moment you leave Jerusalem, let's say you get scholarship and you go to study abroad and you spend a few years, you get a job and you go to work in Dubai for 2, 3, 4 years, whatever, then you're not allowed to come back. You become a refugee, literally, because you don't have, if you are a resident of East Jerusalem, you don't have any citizenship. You don't have a normal passport. You have 2 travel documents, one from Jordan, one from Israel. It's called La Sipaseh. The one from Jordan is not a full passport because you can't go and live in Jordan on it. Jordan requires you to pay actually visa when you get in. So Tel Aviv and all these places, work in Israel. You can vote in the municipality, which maybe we'll come to talk about later, but you can't, you can go to the West Bank. So that's all good stuff. You can't run for the Knesset, you can't vote for the Knesset. So even though you live in the country, you pay taxes equally as any Israeli citizen, but you don't have the same rights. So that's the second group. The third group is the Palestinians in the West Bank. Actually, let me show you a photo of this. So the blue ID is for the Palestinian residents in Jerusalem and the Israeli citizens, although now they're changing and making it magnetic, which is causing a whole other problem because every Palestinian in East Jerusalem who has to change it has to prove that he's lived for a certain amount of time in Jerusalem, and that's causing big issues for the Palestinians who haven't been able to afford it recently and have lived in the West Bank for a bit. And the green ID is the Palestinians in the West Bank. That's how you differentiate, or the soldiers in the checkpoint would differentiate between the two. The Palestinians in the West Bank are supposedly Palestinian citizens, but that's a tricky word because the registrar, or the Ministry of Interior, if you wish, is fully controlled by Israel. Meaning, if you're a Palestinian in Ramallah, married an American, and you want to apply for her or him to move to live with you, the application, even though you are in the West Bank and Palestine, right? The application has to go through Israel to be approved. And good luck for that. If you can get that approved, you'd be extremely lucky. It's going to take many years and so on. Palestinians in the West Bank live mostly in what's called Area A and Area B. Area A is the main cities like Ramallah and Hebron and these places. B and C are kind of the outskirts, the suburbs of, and the farmland of these places. You don't have any rights in Israel whatsoever. You don't have any rights of movement, even between those cities, between Hebron and Ramallah. You often have to go through checkpoints set up by Israel to go from one Palestinian city to another Palestinian city. And sometimes you are told you're not able. For whatever reason, the army could stop that. The Palestinian Authority, which has police only in Area A and a couple of Area Bs, which is literally less than 15% of the West Bank, has to get permits to move and monitor crime between different Palestinian cities. So your rights, you have a Palestinian passport, but as mentioned earlier, that Palestinian passport has to be approved by Israel. All borders are still controlled by Israel. You need visas to most places in the world. Palestinian passport is probably among the weakest possible. And that's, and you need permits to enter into Jerusalem or into any Israeli areas. Those permits are hard to get. My understanding is only about 5% of people in the West Bank have access or really can get those permits. If you're young, which is 70% of Palestinians, you already don't have much chance of getting it if you're under 30, 40 years old.
So voting rights for West Bank Palestinians. Voting rights?
Voting rights, you vote for the Palestinian Authority, which the last election we had was 15 years ago. So pretty much most, I would say half of the population in the West Bank has never voted for president or for a parliament in their lives, which is crazy to think about, that most of us never voted. And yeah, they don't vote anything in Israel. They can vote for municipalities in Palestine, and they can vote for president and parliament, which is not happening. And the last group is in Gaza. Gaza is probably, I mean, there's no reason almost to talk about it, just because imagine the worst of the worst of the worst. Everything I said before, the worst in each one of these groups, and just apply it to Gaza. One, Hamas is in control there, which complicates the whole legal process of, you know, originally the Gaza ID and the West Bank ID were supposed to be the same, but it's not anymore because now Gaza is under Hamas control, which means their Ministry of Interior is not recognized even by the Palestinian Authority, and a lot of negotiations have to happen between the two to get passports and get people able to leave. But to leave through where? You have only two options, through Egypt and through Israel. And you can't really leave it through these two. It's extremely hard to get permits to leave it through either of those borders. So you're stuck. Voting rights, the same as the West Bank. They haven't voted since 2006, the last elections we had for the parliament. And despite all the talks, I'll be really shocked if we see any voting coming any soon.
Thanks, Aziz. That's a really helpful background. So one of your many claims to fame, besides, you know, being TED Talks, Majdi Tours, international speaker, is that you were the first Palestinian to run for mayor of Jerusalem. So could you share a bit about your own personal experience with that, why you choose to run, what status you hold that allowed you to even run, and the response to your running, both from the Palestinian local community as well as the Israeli authorities?
Well, as you can tell, it went so well, and I'm the mayor of Jerusalem right now. No, that run didn't go as well as I hoped it would. And partially, you mentioned the status I hold. The status I hold is a Jerusalem resident, which you would think, being born in Jerusalem, growing up in Jerusalem, having my family in Jerusalem, would qualify me to also being part of 40% of the population in Jerusalem. Palestinians in Jerusalem are almost 40% of the population, 38% more or less. So that's not the case. We are not allowed to run for mayor of Jerusalem. And that's why I decided to run. I know it doesn't make sense, but bear with me. Here's the thing. If Israel keeps deafening us with this argument, we are the only democracy in the Middle East. We are the only democracy in the Middle East. And yet in the city, it claims to be its capital. 40% of the population of that city cannot run for the most important job in that city, then I don't understand what democracy are we talking about. That's not democracy. Think of any city in the United States. If half of the population, third of the population not allowed to run, would you consider that a democracy? That's a joke. Especially that we pay taxes like every other Israeli Jewish resident of the city. We have the same responsibility. I don't understand why we couldn't run for it. But the reason why is because they said you have to be a citizen first. Well, but we not. You didn't give us citizenships. Well, tough luck. And that's the trick in this whole thing. There's always a legal recourse you can take. But good luck, you're not gonna really succeed. And the Supreme Court, when I wanted to apply, said you have to first be rejected and then come in to the court. You only get rejected from the application a month before the elections. How do you run a campaign when you, until a month before, you still cannot even know if you're allowed to run or not? So I still announced my candidacy. I made campaign events. I spoke in the media. did all of that. And I did that because I wanted people to know what does it mean to live as a Palestinian in East Jerusalem. And it wasn't an antagonistic campaign. It wasn't an anti-Israel, anti-Jewish. If anything, I had many Jews in the west side of Jerusalem support me. I think I would have gotten extremely good amount of votes from the Jewish side in Jerusalem when I did my you need to submit certain amount of signatures from people in the city who would nominate you. I got tons of signatures from people in West Jerusalem. It was incredible to do that. So I think we had a really, really good chance if I was allowed to run. Maybe not win the mayor right away, but do have an influence. Now we can run for city council, but not for mayor, so, which I find to be absurd. Again, it's a humiliating. You can be the lower level, but never the upper level. We're not going to allow an Arab to be a mayor. And I remember being asked by the media, how can a Palestinian be a mayor of Jerusalem? You understand the problems in West Jerusalem? We have Hilunim, secular, and Datiim, religious. You're not going to understand. And to me, that was ridiculous because I speak fluent Hebrew. None of the Jewish candidates who were running spoke Arabic. They spoke Hebrew but didn't speak Arabic. So they were going to govern my part of the city without speaking the language. But me, the one who speaks the other language, couldn't. I studied actually quite a bit about Judaism. I worked in Mea Shearim, so I understand a lot about Haredis and religious communities. When I was a student, I worked there for 4 years. I'm like, I know more about you than you would ever know about us. And the fact is, that's the problem. You're trying to govern us when you're not involving us in any decisions. And then you add to it all that discrimination that happens toward us. I'll give you an example. A Palestinian kid in East Jerusalem gets 1/10 of the budget for being a student than an Israeli kid in West Jerusalem. 1/10 of the budget. And then people assume that that Palestinian kid is going to grow up and be successful. They're surprised that poverty in East Jerusalem is way, way higher than poverty in West Jerusalem. You look at zoning rights. Palestinians in East Jerusalem literally have no rights to build anywhere. All the new neighborhoods in East Jerusalem are settlements, meaning they are built for Jewish residents. Not one neighborhood was built for us, for the Palestinians who live there. So where do we go? What do we do? Well, we end up living in more crowded places. We start building illegally, which I'm against as well. But what other options are there? So I wanted to address these issues. That's why I wanted to run for mayor. And I got pressure from both sides. The Israeli side, really, government didn't want me to run because I was exposing this whole bluff about democracy. That democracy didn't apply to me. It applied to the Jewish residents of the city, but not to me as a Palestinian. And the Palestinian government didn't want me to run because they are afraid of young people becoming involved in politics. The average age of a Palestinian leader in the government is 70-some years old. And when I was at that time in 37, 38, when I was running, for them, that was way, way too young, and I'm not associated with them, and they didn't like that. And so I got threats from both sides, different kind of threats, some legal and some physical threats. And people who were running with me, who were all younger than me, were getting threats as well. A student who couldn't go to her university anymore because people threatened to beat her up. That's the intimidation that happens. When I hear about the word voter intimidation, I know definitely what it means. I know people in the old city were told, if you go vote, we will destroy your shop. And then people like me and anybody in East Jerusalem, we again are guests. We don't have, legally speaking, we don't have the same rights. So if the Israeli government says, you either do what we say or we throw you out, what options do we have? So that was the challenge. I still think it was successful because it showed people the issues in East Jerusalem. Israelis who never heard about East Jerusalem problems were able to hear it for the first time. I'm grateful Israeli media did interview me quite a lot, and I'm very grateful for that, the primetime shows. The Palestinians, especially the young, realize that there is a recourse. We can challenge the status quo. We don't have to wait. And for that, I'm grateful to be able to have done it.
Thanks, Aziz. So I'm not exactly sure how to phrase this question, but before this talk, we were having a conversation a little bit about voter suppression versus people just not voting, and the impact of people not voting, both if you have the right to vote and you don't vote, or parties that use people not voting to maintain power. I don't know if you could speak to that issue a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, intimidation not to vote. I just mentioned, for example, the Palestinian Authority didn't want us to vote. I was actually told didn't want us to run as well because they wanted the status quo is good for them. And both the Israeli and the Palestinian government used that toward Palestinians in East Jerusalem. The Palestinian government used the "you better not do it or else." The Israeli government did it more democracy style, I would say. More things we can see all over the world, even in what we would claim are successful democracies whatsoever. So, for example, we were giving a handful of polling stations in all of East Jerusalem. There was zero awareness campaign to let people know that they have the right to vote. Majority of Palestinians in East Jerusalem don't know they have the right to vote. So my campaign faced
in the municipality, not in the Knesset, just to clarify.
That's why they don't know they have the right to vote, because they know they can't vote in the Knesset. So they assume if I can vote for the parliament, I can vote for the municipality. It's logical, and nobody has ever told them they have the right to vote. There's like a handful of polling stations. How do you know? There's not a one sign through all East Jerusalem. You never get your voting registration card, which everybody in West Jerusalem somehow gets it. I never got it living in East Jerusalem. Never. I voted usually, but because I did the research, and so if you live in Kufar Aqab, for example, which is behind the wall. To go to your voting station, you'd have had to get on a bus, get to the checkpoint, get off of the bus, pass the checkpoint, get on a second bus, go to the city center, get in a third bus, and go to wherever your polling station is. And then do the same thing back. That'll take you a full day. You think Americans would vote in as many numbers if that was the way you would have to do it? Have to go through checkpoints, have to go through multiple transportations, and you even often don't know if that is your polling station for sure or not. That's voter intimidation. That is voter suppression, because the fact you have to go through a checkpoint to go vote, that's already voter intimidation. So that's one example. And we argued and fought with the government in Jerusalem, and we were able to get a few more handful of polling stations. Compared to that to West Jerusalem, there's a polling station in every street. Obviously exaggerating, but like there are multiple polling stations in every neighborhood. So that's the thing. I had a campaign where I had to literally convince people that they have the right to vote. Before I had to convince them to vote for me, I had to convince them that they even have a right to vote for the municipality. And that's just ridiculous. And I'll tell you something I don't usually talk about. I try to reach out to the US government, try to reach out to the Europeans, and I asked for their help to let Palestinians know that they have the right to vote. They spend a lot of money on nonprofits and so on. I'm like, can you at least, I don't want you to intervene in the elections, just that people know they have the right to vote. And none were willing.
Some residents have the right to vote in the municipality, just to keep super clear with the different statuses what we talked about.
None of the Europeans or the Americans were willing to help financially or whatever, help organizations, nonprofit organizations who are helping people to know they have the right to vote for the municipality. None. And I've talked to literally every ambassador of the Europeans, talked to people at the US embassy, unhelpful, which tells me in some ways, the world are fine with Palestinians in East Jerusalem being without a voice. The world is fine with the status quo. And that's maybe the most depressing thing about this whole story.
All right, so thank you so much. I'm just fixing the technology. Thank you so much for that. I want to switch over to Avner for a second to just, I think Aziz gave us a really good overview, especially in East Jerusalem, but moreover what the Palestinian state of democracy looks like. And so, Avner, I was hoping you'd be able to sort of tie this together in our last few minutes, and then we're going to switch to a Q&A. So if you're able to stay past an hour, please do for the Q&A. If you're not, this is recorded and we can watch the Q&A after. But please do, if you could give us an overview in terms of, what was the question we wrote out? In what ways do you see the struggles in Israel and Palestine connected to the struggles worldwide for democracy in general? And do you see the protests and the upcoming elections? Like, how do you see the connections here?
I think there are multiple connections, but let me just start by saying that when we started Combatants for Peace, and for quite a few years into this project, we were very much focused on what's going on here. I mean, it's a handful, and as I told you before, our feeling has always been, there's so much injustice going on, there's so much evil going on, that we are unable to, to be in all those places where we're needed. They confiscate land here, they demolish houses here, there's a guy on hunger strike here. It's overwhelming. There is a huge system funded in the billions that is seeking to take land, to move, to give, eventually to take land from one population and give it to another. And in the process, so many other things are happening. And so we were naturally, so much focused on what's going on here. And even more so, I would say, the Palestinians, because whereas for me, this is somewhere else. I'm in West Jerusalem. I travel to the West Bank, but I'm not subject to all of these limitations, some of which Aziz mentioned. But for them, it was even more so a local struggle. And I think over the years, and especially an important turning point was the documentary, Disturbing the Peace, which I humbly recommend if you haven't watched it yet. And it was the interaction with Steve Atkin and the director, one of the directors. He kept saying, what you are talking about, and you're just so much focused on Israel-Palestine, but what you're talking about is really relevant in so many other places. And to be honest, I was like, oh, come on. I mean, we're so small, we're so weak, we are so... But then we traveled with the movie all over the world for about two years, coming and going. And I really began to see that this is all part of a global struggle, universal. And I'm a historian by profession. This is what I do. I am not, Combatants for Peace is a hobby, if you like. And I look at it both in terms of, the world today, but also in terms of, generation handing over the torch to another generation. And I see this struggle as a continuation of the civil rights movement in the US and South Africa and India and Tibet and so many other places, and Black Lives Matter. So on one level, we are fighting, I think, all of us to maintain something of democracy and human dignity, and the very ability to see others as humans, which I feel, at least eroded very rapidly, has been eroded. So we are talking in Combatants for Peace about rehumanizing the other. But I think these things happen worldwide. Now, it's not just the fact that in the US, we see voter suppression, we see anti-immigrant violence, we see all of the other things that are so common in the US in recent years, and in Europe and in so many other places. It is also, and I think this is the most important thing, we need to support each other and learn from each other in all of these different places. I think the right wing is already doing it quite successfully on the level of leaders. Trump is playing off Netanyahu, and they're feeding off each other. They are supporting each other. It's the same with Bolsonaro and Trump and Duterte in the Philippines to some extent, and Orban in Hungary, and so many others. But it's not just the level of leaders. I mean, I remember Steve Bannon touring Europe and, talking to the European extreme right, racist, anti-Semitic, anti-democratic, and he was just sharing his immense experience in all of these things that we stand against. We should be doing the same, and we're not doing it enough. We need to share knowledge, we need to share experiences, and more than everything, I think we need to inspire each other, because political struggles of the type we wage need the hope with which I started, and energy, as we all know, is not simply renewable. It needs a source ultimately. So by meeting activists from Northern Ireland, we have long-term relations with people who've been involved in the violent struggle in Ireland. We learn from their experience, but we are also inspired by them. And people from Bosnia and people from South Africa, and we learn from American activists who've been involved in the Occupy movement, and so on and so forth. So we need to find ways to make these things more stable, the connections, and turn it into something more of a routine, so that we are able to benefit from each other's experience, gains, whatever. And this is why I'm so happy that we have had for several years now American Friends of Combatants for Peace, because I think that what American Friends is doing is not simply, it's not a kind of a support combatants for peace kind of thing. It's about starting new fires, spreading the fire, the kind of fire that gives warmth and heat and light, and not the kind that burns everything indistinctly. So I think this is what we're trying to do also with American Friends, but there's so much more to do, and I hope we'll have the power to go on doing it.
Thanks, Avner. Thanks to all our panelists. So we're gonna do a few minutes of recorded Q&A, and then if people have questions that they don't want to be recorded and put up on Facebook, we'll have a few minutes with the activists privately after I stop the recording. So please put your questions into the chat box if you'd like them to be public. We only have one public question so far. It's a question for Aziz. How can Palestinians like you and others who have a voice that's heard outside of Israel talk without a trace of bitterness or anger about the cruelest oppression that you face every minute of every day?
How can we do that? I think it's difficult when you're living in that kind of reality. It's very hard to separate it from your own feelings. It's very hard to separate it from how you behave. Every time I read the news and I see a story about another Palestinian being tortured in prison, it brings memories to me that my brother was tortured in prison. So it's not easy to separate those things. With that being said, the way I deal with it is I realize that bitterness bitterness doesn't help me. Bitterness pretty much helps more the person who killed my brother, helps more the soldier who stops me at a checkpoint, helps more. It works against my own cause. It makes me miserable. It makes me unhappy. It makes me feel the occupation 10 times worse. And so the way I work against bitterness, against that feeling of I want to revenge, I want them to feel as bad as I feel, the way I deal with that is by realizing this is me surrendering to that feeling, is me accepting the occupation in some ways, me being the slave of the person who occupied me, because I'm responding in the way he wants me or she wants me to respond, not in the way I should. It's not easy, and so I really have a hard time judging those who struggle with it, because for many years I struggled with it. For many years I was very angry and very bitter and didn't know how to get out of it. But I think there is definitely a path, and I think we're way more influential and we can generate way more change by not surrendering to bitterness and revenge.
Thanks, Aziz. So the next two questions are pretty related. I'm just going to read them out, and I think people will see the relatedness. We have one that says, I live in the US and believe that not only the US needs to be educated about the state of democracy, but the world needs to be educated. How would we do this? The other question is, how do we build on these amazing on-the-ground activists and activism to reach the highest political level? For example, the thousands of people protesting in Balfour in front of Bibi's home, how do we raise the chances of actually affecting the activities in the Knesset? And how do we use people power to reach the top levels? So both in Israel and the US and internationally, I think the questions are related. So whoever wants to take that, it's a bit of a big one.
I'd say that I'm talking about Israel, of course. The political level, unfortunately, for the last 20 years, since the Second Intifada, is completely removed from the West. I mean, the West Bank, the Palestinian issue, is not an issue. I mean, they just keep their distance. And even politicians that we know that are, I would say, sensitive, at least, I mean, in a sense that they care to some extent, and that they are more or less decent human beings, they make sure they keep their distance because they don't want to be branded left-wing, which has become, denigration here in Israel. And I'm saying this, like we've had talks with members of Knesset, some of them are pretty prominent, and we took them on tours to the West Bank, and they just keep silent for the most part. One of them told us, it's not going to come from us, because politicians react to the public's, public discourse, and they check where the wind is going and they follow. So you need to change the wind. You need to change the direction of the wind. And, it wouldn't be a surprise if I told you that we were unable to change the direction of the wind. I cannot see at the moment a shortcut to the people up top. The only strategy I see at the moment, of course we're trying and we have our connections to politicians, but we need to change things on the grassroots level. Not that I'm extremely hopeful there, but I think with the Balfour demonstrations, as I said in the beginning, there is more willingness to listen and to see the similarities, even though these are not really similarities. I mentioned this before. You try to do 1/10 of what we do in Balfour in the West Bank, and you'll be shot at, arrested, and risk death for much less. So it's not really the same, but for Israelis who've never faced policemen, clubs, and horsemen and tear gas, suddenly, oh, I never thought about it. I never felt it on the of the gun, and suddenly they feel it. So again, most of them will not take it that far, and many of them have served. You know, some of the people that, you know, in Kochav's age group, they just, you know, they're fresh out of the army. They just bursted into Palestinian houses in the middle of the night. It's not so easy to acknowledge that. And what do you do with that? So many of them are just, you know, they close it in for quite a few years. But I think some are willing to you know, open up and see how we are all facing on different levels, to different intensities, the risks of a non-democratic. I mean, for the Palestinian, it has never been democratic. It's anti-democratic. But as Kochav said, it's seeping in. It's going into green line Israel. And this is what we are trying to say all the time.
Thank you. So I think on that note, we are going to formally end the webinar, but our activists are willing to stay. So if people, we have a few more questions in the chat box, which people can bring to their attention. I'll bring up as well. But I just want to say thank you so much to everybody who is both here live and listening in on this recording. We're so grateful that you've joined us. Please join our third election webinar on November 10, after the US elections, with how do we go from here. That information will be online, and I will be sending everybody a follow-up email after this. So please do check your emails or your spam or promotions folder just in case. And I look forward to being in touch with all of you. Thank you so much for joining us. We're really grateful to have you as part of our community.